You might want to add light. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Metabolic. As I was just giving Ryan that he's a little in the dark from how I view him, but maybe he's trying to hide from us a little bit here. Anyhow, welcome back to our fourth episode of the Metabolic. And we are going to talk about kind of two topics that blend together: the discovery of a new, what is now being deemed the third essential fatty acid. And as we have omega-3s and omega-6s, which currently meet that definition. The government hasn't put the full stamp on it yet, but it is what is referred to as C15. So with C15, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about also how this kind of leads into the whole dietary food pyramid, saturated fat story as well. And just kind of throw it a little bit back and forth. This is going to be a pretty quick, under a half hour episode today, and hope everybody enjoys it. So Ryan, when we were chatting a week ago about what should it be our next topic, you said, how about C15? I said, sounds awesome. Let's go. Why don't I quick throw it to you for what was your first thoughts on why you thought this would be a great topic?
Well, I think it kind of really highlights the issue of context when people are discussing nutrition and nutritional strategies and specific nutritional molecules. And that we have to be nuanced in our discussions. And I think that the C15 issue kind of highlights the problem of people talking about saturated fat as if it's one thing, right? And, we've been demonizing saturated fat for 70 years, again, as if it's one thing. And so I think that was interesting. I've been guilty of that myself for a lot of years. And I think I've learned as I've gone through my personal journey to always think about what people say and what you read from a contextual standpoint and a nuanced perspective. So that's why I found the C15 issue interesting.
Absolutely.
Because, and I think that, a lot of it makes sense, and I like it from the perspective of, hey, this is pretty cool stuff that we're seeing with C15 and issues of potential deficiencies because we've been telling people to avoid saturated fats for many, many years. And could this be, the hypothesis would be that could this be, contributing to some of the problems? I've heard different things. 1 in 3 people might be deficient. I've heard 75% of people have cellular fragility syndrome, which is this new physiological cellular abnormality that relates to the cells being deficient in C15. And ferroptosis, which is programmed cell death, and that ferroptosis contributing to insulin resistance. And is this just another mechanism behind the syndrome of insulin resistance that we see so prevalent in today's society? And it highlights that things are very complex, right? It's not just carbohydrates. It could be other things. It can be saturated fats in certain contexts. And it's interesting, when I see patients and I hear from patients, well, this provider or this nutritionist or this dietitian told me that I should be cutting back on my saturated fat. And that actually isn't necessarily incorrect if the assumption is that you're going to continue to eat the standard American diet. And we know that people who are eating the standard American diet, which is protein deficient and high in carbohydrates, are a setup for increased saturated fats in the diet. And again, I'm generalizing again. I'm talking about saturated fats as if they're one thing. But when you are taking in totality higher amounts of saturated fats, you are getting saturated fats that have the potential to do some harm. In that context, again, with the assumption that nobody's going to change their standard American diet. And there are actually mechanisms behind that, which many people have discussed on social media platforms and on blogs and in posts and on podcasts and related to saturated fats, especially the even chain saturated fats ability to stimulate receptors that increase something called ceramides, which are sphingolipids that have, to make this quite simple and not go too much into the weeds, that have the downstream effect of blocking the insulin cascade. And ceramides are a mechanism for insulin resistance. So that's the potential that saturated fats have for harm, but again, in a certain context. So I thought it was awesome that we see here, they're calling it we talk about it from even chain saturated fats versus odd chain saturated fats, and odd chain, being health promoting, and C15 being referred to as the Goldilocks. C15. Why is it the Goldilocks? I don't know. It does seem to have some really cool effects. One of which is a metabolite of C15. So as C15 is metabolized, a metabolite is actually an endocannabinoid. So another cool finding that it's a full endocannabinoid stimulating CB1 and CB2 receptors and can have favorable impacts on pain syndromes and mood, so mental health benefits, etc. So some really cool work being done. Does this mean we should be supplementing C15? I don't think the data is clear yet. I think from my perspective, the message should be, hey, I think we've gotten this saturated fat partly wrong. I think full fat dairy sources of C15 are potentially going to be very helpful. And it doesn't actually take a lot. And you can give your example there on something called pecorino cheese, right? So full fat dairy is a good.
I'm going to share a quick little screenshot, and then we'll go to a second one and do even more. But right here, folks can see that there is a Pecorino Romano cheese, and this is actually a sheep's milk based cheese. And as I started kind of going down this C15 rabbit hole, as things started popping, it's really been for about 6 months that if you pay attention to the metabolic health space, that this has started to hit the awareness out there. So yes, as I always do, I go way deeper down the rabbit hole because I want to hear a lot about things, and I don't want to only hear one person's take on things, or just the person, whether it's the scientist that was pure science and great findings, or now that they've also created a supplement company to help bring this out forward. Because yeah, there's definitely deficiency across probably most of the population with C15. So if you took a small slice off of a little wedge of this wedge of cheese each day, you're going to have more than enough C15. If you want to eat sardines, which I worked into my diet 5 years ago once, even though they kind of repulsed me for most of my life, there's a couple of things that I have very much. You can train your taste buds to at least be palatable enough to eat them and enjoy them and not be detested by them. But if you're not a big cheese fan, maybe check out the Pecorino cheese. Check into fish like sardines, especially the ones that still have their skin on them. That's where the best source of the fat that's going to come from the fish basis. But there's others. And let me just also quick bring up one other, or let me quick say stop sharing that and just bring up one more quick thing for the audience here to understand. A great resource for if you want to go learn more about all of this outside of just type C15 into YouTube and you're going to find an awful lot of health influencers out there that have interviewed the lady who was from the CDC and the WHO, and then the Navy brought in for researching, because she was a veterinary epidemiologist, and she brought in because the Navy has very number of school of dolphins and realized that some of them were struggling. And that's where we learned about all of this C15. But you can see right here at discoverc15.com that you show up at the site, and you can go down the whole rabbit hole as far as how this is the first essential new fatty acid discovered in 15 years, and heard TED talk about all of this. Talking about it being an essential fatty acid, how it restores cellular health and function, whole body health related to it. Learn more. And then they also have newsletters where you can really deep dive, and they have other places where you get into the molecule of it. And one of the things I always personally try to do with this is because you can say, and I think Ryan, you know, like yourself, where you opened up saying you demonize saturated fat for years based on the dogma of teaching inside of mainstream medicine. I'm as guilty of it as well, because in my 10 years in the corporate wellness disease management world, when I found out my brother was doing something that suddenly talked about saturated fat is not bad for you, and there's nuance to this LDL conversation, it was my previous dogma and training, coaching training, and things like this that led me to believe that, oh my God, I've got to go save his life. I got to show him the studies, which led me on my whole journey on all of this. So check out discoverc15.com. You'll learn about, as Ryan mentioned, there's a new fourth form of cell death. So not only do we have a new third type of essential fatty acid here, we have now a fourth discovered form of cell death that before 12 years ago, nobody had ever heard of, ferroptosis, and what that can mean to, if your cell linings don't have enough of this fatty acid, making them up, and if the membranes of your red blood cells don't have enough in there, the macrophages that are just resident in your liver wind up sensing what's going on with these red blood cells and start destroying them. So yes, I think, just to build off of what Ryan was saying, we have gone down, and without fully understanding much of science, and I'm not saying we fully understand science today, because it is always evolutionary and we're always going to continue to be learning. But yes, we've demonized many things that I believe have led to epidemics of hypertension, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, chronic kidney disease, heart disease, all of these things, because we started messing with making recommendations about things that we had no idea what the end results were going to be. So I'm going to quick stop sharing that. And again, you can go to discoverc15.com and go down the rabbit hole, and a number of great metabolic health influencers out there talked about this. But as you and I both used to be probably more plant-centric in our thinking, and thinking that meats and saturated fats were a problem, one of the things I now do is there are definitely what you would call the diet wars that go on out in the nutritional space. And there is what we'll call the vegan vegetarian side of it. And now there is what you would call the carnivore side of it. And I think really right in the middle of it, because the carnivore and the vegetarian and even vegan are all supported on what I do in my coaching in a metabolic therapy based coaching, where leverage the physiological state that we were all born in, the state of nutritional ketosis, that almost 90% of our ancestors prior to 1900 or 1920 all lived within, because there just wasn't enough food options, and the average person didn't eat pie and ice cream and drink Coca-Cola on a daily basis. It just wasn't part of our environment, which created this new, or exasperated this other physiologic state called sugar burner. And when you're constantly messing with hyperglycemia, thus automatically hyperinsulinemia, these things have major problems and issues. And that's the only way that I now see things from a saturated fat standpoint. Yes, if you're on Coca-Cola, ice cream, cookies, and everything else, and as Ryan and I have both professed at previous times, just like if we were at an AA meeting, hi, my name is Brett, and I'm a sugar addict, and Ryan's done the same on previous of our podcasts. When you're mixing fats that have always been on our diets forever with these things that are very new to our diets, there's a problem with that. So you have to decide which side of the fence are you going to go to, and you can be healthy on both sides. I honestly, personally believe, and in 2014, when I went more the vegetarian vegan and did, a couple months of heavy duty juicing, while I know there are people who can, for a while at least, thrive with all of that, as long as they're amateur chemists and they understand that there's only 5 years worth of B12 stored in your liver if you're topped off properly. If not, you'll deplete that and you need to restore certain things. So there's supplementation that needs to happen on certain sides of the fence. Carnivore is just closest to zero carb as possible. And you can achieve both of these and still be in nutritional ketosis, achieve metabolic therapy, and allow the body to be healing. But when I went to a more vegan influencer, they were trying to say, oh, this is just, bad information again. Here we go. Somebody who wants to sell a C15 supplement is trying to make money. And if you eat the right amount of fiber in your diet, you're going to create enough of that. But the scientists who have studied this say, no, that's not true. I went to ChatGPT and I asked, can you get this? And it says there is nothing in the literature at all that supports that claim that through fiber, you're going to get the proper amounts of C15. Because if so, a lot of people are eating a lot of grains and would be getting enough fiber to be making that C15 on their own. So anyhow, we're not sitting here telling anybody to go supplement with C15 outside of what we would call normal dietary situations. I believe that through the amount of meat, fish, and eggs I'm eating, I eat enough cheese, and I now eat pecorino because one, it's delicious, and two, I know it's got a great source of the C15 in here. And these are pretty easy things to address through normal diet. That's really kind of me getting off my soapbox on all of this. Ryan, I'll throw it back to you for our last 5 minutes of anything else you'd like to add on the topic, or please debunk anything you don't agree with that I just said.
Yeah, no, I agree with the comments that you've made, and so I'm not going to debunk you, but I'll just add that, when you talk about the diet wars, the other side will often use the argument based on value judgments related to the effect that saturated fat can have on LDL cholesterol, LDL-C, right? So anything that can raise LDL-C is bad. Anything that lowers LDL-C is good. And that's a value judgment based on a hypothesis.
Yet to be proven hypothesis.
Correct. Yes. And in fact, as we go on and on in time here, if a hypothesis is truly true, if it's correct, all the ensuing data should be in support of that. Whereas more and more data seems to be diminishing the hypothesis, meaning that the hypothesis is probably not correct.
And let me play off that for 10 seconds. I think the hypothesis is dead and buried, and it's only those that don't want to give up on all of the training and everything they've been telling everybody for decades is the only reason that it's still alive. But go ahead.
Yeah. The other arguments that people will use is that substitution studies, interventional trials where saturated fat is substituted out for N6 PUFAs, show reductions in liver fat. And I think that, the problem with that data again is relates, number one, to what condition actually associates with more saturated fat in the blood, plasma saturated fat, and it's actually increasing amounts of carbohydrates do that. And high fat, low carbohydrate diets do not associate with increases in plasma saturated fat. And there's other significant data that sort of supports the feeling that saturated fat is not a harmful nutrient, in the right context.
In a historical context.
Historical context, right? There's we can put this in the show notes if you're able to. There's a study in 2014, actually, Volk et al. VOLK, showing demonstrating this issue of the differential effects on plasma saturated fat. There's the high fat DASH study showing benefits of a DASH type approach that's high fat. There's just historical trends, the paradox of ever decreasing saturated fat consumption over time, but an explosion of the obesity, insulin resistance epidemics. So is saturated fat really, based on historical trends, causing liver fat, insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, et cetera? Overfeeding studies are another example. I'll also just mention the issue of protein and the effect on liver fat. So we actually know from studies that if you have protein consumption that's deficient, less than 20% of your calories, any fat will cause liver fat. Yes, it is true. You need about 30% more choline in your diet to inhibit the effect that saturated fat can have on the development of liver fat relative to N6 PUFAs. But if you're in a protein optimal state, no fat will cause liver fat.
And you're getting so much choline from your standard, more carnivore side of a metabolic therapy, nutritional ketosis diet,
yes,
than you ever going to need.
This is the methionine choline deficiency model, which is actually used in animal studies to promote liver fat. So again, protein optimized, don't fear the fats, especially your C15 fats. And a protein optimized, refined carbohydrate restricted dietary approach.
And I'll bring that home with just one more message on top of it. And then I'm going to, when people saw me bend over, I want to show something before we're done with this show episode. But yeah, I mean, the fats, basically, if we threw out all nutritional science of the last 70 years, I don't think we would look anything like the way the population looks right now. It's just not, it's what has been done to us through poor advice that has changed all of this, because all you have to do is go to a channel like No Carb Life, hosted by Dave Mack. I've been on 3 episodes. Ryan's been on 1, and he's pushing to get to 1,000 personal success stories of people who, using a form of either the keto and or carnivore diet, how these people are reversing almost every medical condition known to man, doing the 1 and 2 and 3 things that have been the 3 biggest messages to us in nutritional science. Stay away from eggs, stay away from red meat, stay away from saturated fats, and stay away from anything that had a face, I guess is another way of saying it, but before it got to your plate. And that if you just ignore that you're probably going to be okay, as long as you're not also a sugar addict and keep feeding that sugar and ice cream and cookie and everything else that goes along with it. So I don't think we would have gotten here if these things were terrible things for us, because they were the mainstay of most people's diets through most of human history. So I'll throw it back to you for a last word on that before I want to do a quick promo.
Two things when you're thinking about PUFA versus saturated fats. There hasn't been a single human trial that showed PUFA versus saturated fat showing progression to NASH. So it's one thing to have some fat in your liver. It's a whole nother thing.
Define NASH for the people that don't know NASH.
Non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So inflammation in your liver, which is the risk factor for going on to cirrhosis of your liver, right? So I would much rather have a little bit more saturated fat, even if there was a slight potential for there some fat to be in my liver, than to have a bunch of PUFAs in there, which are the requirement for oxidative stress and inflammation, which is what's going to give you the risk for progression to NASH. One last thing is that atherosclerotic plaques, when you look at the fatty acid composition of atherosclerotic plaques, which is the most prevalent fatty acid in a plaque? Linoleic acid, N6. There you go. End of story.
Amen. Well, I think that's a great little bullet point to put at the end of the sentence of this. So I'm going to just quick, in 30 seconds here, sum up so people can see from my t-shirt that I have on. I was in Washington, D.C. this last weekend for the very first Metabolic Revolution event, the first of what will be hundreds and hopefully eventually thousands, and that this will be happening around the world. Please feel free to go and check out metabolicrevolution.org. We will be posting, we had 14 world-class metabolic health doctors, psychiatrists, and researchers from around the world presenting on the stage, the Sylvan stage, right on the grounds of the Washington Monument. So as I was up, and then 15 of us did our own little quick testimonials, of which I had a sign I made showing all the conditions and my before and after picture for that personally. But it is, this is one of the posters that I brought back with me that I'll figure out whether it's going to be visible as part of the studio or office in here all the time. But people, please go check out metabolicrevolution.org. And as Ryan and I have just said, we're not for or against any way of achieving metabolic health. If you want to do it more plant-based, there's options there for you. If you want to do it more carnivore-based, there's options. And success can happen in any part of that spectrum, depending upon where your journey's been in the past. So we will throw those show notes or those studies Ryan just referenced. I'll have him shoot those to me. I'll add them into the show notes before we make this live. But thanks everybody for joining us for another Metabochondriacs episode. And we hope you join us again in the near future as we bring episode number 5 to you. Have a great day.
Thanks, Brett. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.
Alrighty.